The morning Edna Atwood heard the marshal's horse on the road, she was already 3 steps ahead of him, moving through her kitchen with the practiced calm of a woman who had learned that panic was a luxury she could not afford. It was the spring of 1878, in the Oklahoma Territory, where the red earth ran like old blood between the scrub oak and the tall grass, and where the law was a thing that meant different things to different people, depending on which side of it you happened to be standing on. Edna's homestead sat at the edge of a wide, flat piece of land that her late husband, Thomas Atwood, had claimed 7 years prior, before a fever took him in the winter of 1875 and left her with 240 acres, a milk cow, a kitchen garden, and a root cellar that had since become the most important secret in 4 counties. She was 32 years old, with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned back severely, though strands of it always escaped and curled against the sides of her face in the heat. Her hands were rough from work. Her eyes were a clear, sharp gray that people often said looked like creek water in winter, and her jaw had a set to it that her neighbors recognized as the kind that did not move once her mind was made up. She had no children of her own. She had something better, she told herself on the hard nights. She had purpose. The root cellar beneath her barn had been dug wide and deep by Thomas, who had been a man who believed in being prepared for anything. There were 2 rooms down there, not one, which was unusual, and Thomas had lined them both with timber and packed sod over the roof so thick that even in summer the temperature stayed cool and steady. He had put in ventilation shafts disguised as fence posts on the far side of the barn's east wall, and he had never once explained to any neighbor why a man would need 2 rooms and 4 ventilation posts for storing potatoes. Thomas Atwood had been a quiet man with a long memory and a sense of justice that came from somewhere deep and old in him, and Edna had loved him for it completely. After he died, she had kept the cellar the way he had built it. And then, in the autumn of 1875, barely 6 months after Thomas was in the ground, a family had come to her door in the dark. A father, a mother, 3 children, and an elderly grandmother, all of them free black Americans trying to move north out of Texas after a group of white men had burned their farm to the ground and threatened worse. They had heard there was a woman alone on a wide stretch of land with a barn that sat away from the road, and that she had a root cellar, and that she was the kind of woman who did not talk. Edna had opened the door, looked at them for exactly 4 seconds, and then stepped aside and said, "Come in and eat first. Then I will show you where you will sleep." They had stayed 11 days. She had given them food and warmth, and on the last morning, directions north that she had carefully written out on a piece of paper, along with the name of a Quaker family in Kansas who she had corresponded with through a circuit preacher. When they left, she had wept quietly into her apron for about 3 minutes, and then she had gone back to work. That had been the beginning. Over the 3 years since, the word had spread the way important words always spread among people who needed it most, passed mouth to mouth and hand to hand like water in a desert. Edna Atwood's farm, the woman with the red barn and the root cellar. She does not ask questions and she does not turn people away. 12 families in 3 years. Some of them stayed a few days, some of them stayed weeks, some of them arrived in such desperate condition that it took Edna the better part of a month to get them well enough to travel. There had been a Cherokee family displaced by continued land seizures, who had stayed through a hard January and helped her repair her fence line before they moved on. There had been a Mexican family, 2 brothers and their wives and a collection of children, who had been driven off land that had been in their family since before Texas was Texas. There had been former enslaved people, freedmen and women who found that freedom on paper and freedom in practice were 2 wildly different things in the post-war South and Southwest. There had been a white family too, a Quaker husband and his wife and 4 daughters, who were being run out of their county for refusing to cooperate with a vigilante group that had taken to calling itself a Committee of Public Safety. Edna had taken them all. She had fed them all. She had kept their secrets and sent them on their way north with full stomachs and written directions, and as much dried food as she could spare. She had told no one. Not her nearest neighbor, old Agnes Pierce, who was kind but who also talked. Not the circuit preacher, who was sympathetic but whose sympathies had a radius of about 3 miles before they became complicated. Not anyone at the general store in the town of Guthrie Creek, 4 miles east, where she went twice a month for supplies, and where people had long since stopped asking why a woman alone needed so much salt pork and dried beans and lamp oil. She had become very good at lying by omission, which she did not consider lying at all. She simply had a large appetite. She simply did a lot of preserving. She simply believed in being prepared. And then the spring of 1878 had come, and with it, United States Marshal Simon Sullivan. He had arrived in Guthrie Creek 3 weeks prior, assigned to the territory out of the federal court in Fort Smith, Arkansas, where Judge Isaac Parker ran his jurisdiction with an iron fist and a deep sense of moral seriousness. Marshal Sullivan had come to investigate reports of a network of individuals who were, according to certain prominent citizens and a state legislator from Texas, illegally harboring fugitives and disrupting the lawful return of individuals to their proper jurisdictions, which was a long and bureaucratic way of saying that someone was helping people escape from men who believed they still had the right to control them. Edna had heard about the new marshal within 48 hours of his arrival, because that was how small towns worked. Agnes Pierce had told her at the general store, leaning in close with her eyes wide and her voice low, saying that he was a tall man, serious-looking, and that he had asked Jacob Finney at the land office a great many questions about properties in the surrounding area. Edna had nodded and said that was interesting, and then she had purchased her salt pork and her lamp oil and driven her wagon home at a pace that was deliberately and carefully unhurried, and then she had spent the rest of the afternoon thinking through every contingency she could imagine. The family currently in her root cellar was the 12th. They had arrived 5 days ago. The Ray's family, a woman named Consuelo and her 3 daughters and her elderly father, who had been pushed off their land in southern Texas by a man who had forged documents and had the county sheriff in his pocket. The grandfather, a dignified old man named Roberto who refused to be broken by anything the world had so far thrown at him, had a bad knee that made walking long distances painful, and they had needed to rest and recover before moving north. So when Edna heard the horse on the road that bright Tuesday morning in April, and recognized by the sound of it that whoever was riding was doing so with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who was not passing through but arriving, she set down her bread dough, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked to the window. The man riding toward her property was tall in the saddle, on a good sorrel horse, wearing a dark coat and a hat pulled low against the morning sun. He had a badge that caught the light when he turned, and he rode with the particular straight-backed ease of a man who was comfortable on horseback and knew it. Edna watched him for exactly 5 seconds. Then she walked to the back door, stepped out into the morning air, and made her way across the yard to the barn with measured, purposeful steps. She lifted the barn's heavy door, went inside to the back wall, and pulled open the concealed panel that Thomas had built into the timber, behind which was the stairs down to the root cellar. She rapped twice on the lower door, their signal for quiet, and when she heard the soft acknowledgment from within, she pulled the panel closed, walked back through the barn, and came out the front side just as Marshal Simon Sullivan was dismounting at her fence post. She met him in the yard with her apron still on, and a look on her face that she had practiced in her small mirror enough times to know it read as nothing more than mild, neighborly curiosity. He was, she noticed, not what she had expected. She had been expecting a man like the other marshals she had encountered, who tended to be either pompous or rough-edged or some combination of both. This man was perhaps 35, lean but solid across the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered by sun and time into something that stopped well short of hard. His eyes, when he tipped his hat back to look at her, were a deep brown, the kind of brown that reminded her of good soil after rain. He had a serious mouth and a jaw that had not seen a razor in a few days, and there was something around his eyes, some quality she could not immediately name, that struck her as careful. Not suspicious, exactly, careful. "Mrs. Atwood," he said. His voice was quieter than she expected. Not soft exactly, measured. "That is correct," she said. "I am United States Marshal Simon Sullivan, out of Fort Smith." He reached into his coat and produced a document which he held out to her across the fence. "I have a writ authorizing me to search premises in this area as part of an ongoing federal investigation." Edna took the paper, read it thoroughly, which took about 30 seconds, and handed it back. "You are authorized to search," she said. "I have nothing to hide. Would you like to start with the house or the barn?" He blinked. Whatever he had been expecting her to say, it had not been that. "I will start wherever you suggest," he said, and there was something in his voice that she could not entirely read. "Then come inside first," she said. "I have coffee on, and a man should not search a property on an empty stomach. It leads to poor attention." She turned and walked back to the house, and after a moment she heard him loop his horse's reins over the fence post and follow her. Inside her kitchen, she poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove, set one in front of him at the table, and went back to her bread dough as though the presence of a federal marshal with a search writ in her kitchen was entirely unremarkable. Simon Sullivan sat down, wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, and looked at her. "You seem very calm, Mrs. Atwood," he said. "I am a widow farming 240 acres alone," she said, without looking up from the dough. "If I was not calm, I would have gone mad 3 years ago." There was a silence. She heard him take a sip of the coffee. "I am sorry about your husband," he said. "Thank you," she said. "He was a good man." Another silence. She shaped the loaves and moved them to the pan with smooth, practiced motions. "Mrs. Atwood, I will be straight with you, because I think you are the kind of woman who prefers it." "I am," she said. "There have been reports, from several sources, that this property has been used to shelter individuals who are being actively sought by law enforcement in Texas and other territories." She turned and looked at him then directly with those clear gray eyes. "Sought by law enforcement," she said. "Or sought by men who say they are law enforcement." Something moved across his face, a flicker of something she could not name. "The reports come through official channels," he said carefully. "The reports come from men who are angry that their former property has learned to walk away," she said, and her voice was steady as stone. "I am aware of what is happening in this territory, Marshal Sullivan. I read newspapers. I know the difference between a fugitive and a person running for their life." He looked at her for a long moment. "Do you have anyone on this property right now who is not yourself?" "No," she said, and she held his gaze without flinching because this was the truth as she understood it. The Ray's family was not on the property. They were under it. He studied her face for what felt like a very long time, and she studied his in return, and something passed between them in that kitchen that was not entirely about warrants and investigations. "I still need to search the property," he said. "I know," she said. "Finish your coffee first." He finished his coffee. She noted that he drank it black and without comment on its quality, which she appreciated. She also noted that he had folded his hands around the cup rather than holding the handle, which was the habit of a man who was cold, or who was tired, or who was uncertain, and needed something solid to hold onto. And she thought that an interesting thing to notice about a federal marshal. Then he stood, set the cup down, and she led him outside. She showed him the house first, every room, every closet, every corner. She showed him the cellar stairs beneath the kitchen, which led to a small, low space where she kept her preserving jars and her root vegetables, the visible, ordinary cellar that anyone would expect to find. She showed him the smokehouse and the chicken coop and the well and the kitchen garden. Then she walked him to the barn. The barn was large and smelled of horse and hay and the particular dusty sweetness of dry timber in spring. Her 2 horses stood in their stalls. Her milk cow turned a slow, incurious head toward them. There were stacked bales of hay along one wall and her farm equipment along the other, and at the back, the timber wall that concealed the panel that led to the stairs that led to the Ray's family. Simon Sullivan walked slowly around the barn's interior, examining it with careful eyes. He looked at the hay bales. He looked at the equipment. He walked to the back wall and pressed one hand flat against the timber, and Edna felt her heart do something she had not felt it do in 3 years, which was to knock hard against the inside of her ribs in something that was not entirely fear. He stood there at that wall for a long, still moment. She watched him. The morning light came in through the barn's high windows and caught the side of his face, and she could see the line of his jaw and the furrow between his brows and the expression on his face that was, she realized, the expression of a man working through something complicated in his mind. He turned away from the wall. "I do not find anything here," he said, and his eyes met hers, and she understood with a certainty that went down through her like cold water that he had known what was behind that wall and had chosen to say what he said anyway. She held his gaze for a moment that stretched long enough to have weight. "Then I suppose your search is done," she said. "I suppose it is," he said. They walked back out into the morning together, and she watched him mount his horse, and he looked at her from the saddle with those careful brown eyes, and she felt that she ought to say something and could not find a single word that would not say too much. "I expect I may have further questions," he said, "in the course of the investigation." "I expect you know where to find me," she said. He nodded, turned his horse, and rode away down the road without looking back. Edna stood in her yard watching him until the sorrel horse and the dark coat disappeared around the bend in the road, and then she let out a long, slow breath that she felt she might have been holding for the better part of an hour. She went back to the barn and rapped twice on the panel. "All clear," she said softly. "He is gone." There was a moment, and then the panel moved and Consuelo Reyes appeared in the opening, her dark eyes wide and her face pale with the effort of having stayed very, very still for a very long time. Behind her, her 3 daughters clustered, and old Roberto appeared at the back, his expression unreadable and dignified. "Is it safe?" Consuelo whispered. "For now," Edna said. Come up and eat." She fed them. She always fed them first before anything else because in her experience food was the most basic form of reassurance that a person could offer. She made a large pot of corn porridge and set out bread from yesterday's baking and the last of the smoked venison from her winter stores, and she sat at the table with them while they ate, and Roberto Reyes looked at her from across the table with eyes that had seen much and gave away little, and then he said, in careful English with a Spanish cadence to it, "The Marshal, he knew." "I believe so," she said. "And yet he went away." "And yet he went away," she agreed. Roberto was quiet for a moment, pulling apart a piece of bread with fingers that were knotted with age. "He is either a good man," he said, "or a man who is buying time." "Yes," Edna said. "Which do you think?" She thought about the hand flat against the timber wall. She thought about the careful brown eyes and the measured voice and the expression of a man working through something complicated. "I think," she said slowly, "that I am not yet sure. But I am going to proceed as though you need to be on your way north as soon as Roberto's knee will allow it." Roberto straightened in his chair with the particular dignity of a man who did not like to be the limiting factor in any situation. "My knee," he announced, "will allow it tomorrow." Edna looked at him with her gray eyes. "Day after tomorrow," she said, "and that is not a question." He looked at her for a long moment and then very slowly smiled. "You are a formidable woman, Mrs. Atwood," he said. "I had a good teacher," she said, and she thought of Thomas, and the ache of it was old and familiar and bearable now, the way an old scar is bearable. 2 days later, well before dawn, she loaded the Ray's family into her wagon, buried under a thick layer of hay, and drove them to a farm 12 miles north where a man named Amos Whitfield, who was part of the network she had quietly cultivated over 3 years, would take them the next leg of the journey. She drove back home in the gray early morning light, unhitched the wagon, put the horses up, and went inside to make coffee. She was sitting at her kitchen table with her second cup when she heard the horse on the road again, and looked up, and saw through the window that it was the sorrel horse and the dark coat of Marshal Simon Sullivan. She sat very still for a moment. Then she got up and got another cup from the shelf. He knocked. She opened the door. He was holding his hat in his hands, which was the first time she had seen him without it on, and his dark hair was longer than she had realized, curling slightly at the ends in the morning damp. He looked at her with those careful eyes and said, "I am not here on official business this morning." "Then why are you here?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I found myself riding past," he said, which was not an explanation at all because her property was not on the way to anywhere in particular and they both knew it. She stepped back from the door. "There is coffee," she said. He came in. He sat at her table. She poured the coffee and sat across from him, and for a time neither of them spoke, and the morning birds were loud outside the window and the kitchen was warm from the stove. "The Ray's family," he said finally without preamble. She looked at him across the cup. "They are safely away," he said. It was not a question. "I would not know anything about that," she said, which was, she reflected, a rather magnificent lie given the circumstances. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. "Mrs. Atwood," he said. "Marshal Sullivan," she said. He turned the cup in his hands, that gesture she had noticed before, wrapping his fingers around the ceramic rather than the handle. "I am going to tell you something," he said, "and I would ask you to consider it carefully before you decide how to respond." "I am listening," she said. He raised his eyes to her face. "I grew up in Missouri," he said. "My father was a free black man. My mother was Irish. I have had reason, many times in my life, to understand what it means to exist in a space that the law has decided is outside its protection." Edna said nothing. She held his gaze. "I took this appointment because I was told it was about law and order," he said. "I have discovered that what it is actually about, at least as far as the men who filed those reports are concerned, is about using the apparatus of federal law to force people back into conditions that are not substantially different from slavery." He said this flatly, without drama, with the tone of a man who has worked through his anger and come out the other side into something colder and more resolved. "I cannot," he said, "in good conscience continue this investigation in the direction it has been pointed." Edna set down her cup very carefully. "That," she said, "is a dangerous position for a federal marshal to be in." "I am aware," he said. "What will you do?" He was quiet for a moment. "I will file a report," he said, "that says I searched the properties in question and found no evidence of the activities alleged." He paused. "Which is technically accurate." Something moved through her chest, warm and complicated. "You will be putting yourself at risk." "People have been putting themselves at risk to help other people for as long as there have been people," he said, and then he looked at her directly and said, "I think you know something about that." She looked at him for a long moment. This careful, serious man with the weathered face and the dark eyes and the coffee cup held between his palms. And she thought about Thomas, who had built the cellar and the ventilation posts and never explained why. And she thought about all the people who had come through her dark and the faces of them in the lamplight. And she felt something that she had not felt in a very long time, which was the sense that she was not entirely alone in what she was doing. 12 families, she said quietly, in 3 years. His eyes widened slightly. 12. Men and women and children and grandparents, she said. People with nowhere to go who needed somewhere to be for a while. She wrapped her own hands around her cup. Thomas built the cellar. He was a man who planned ahead. She glanced up. He died before we ever had occasion to use it the way it was meant to be used, I think. But he built it for exactly this. Simon Sullivan looked at her, and she saw in his face something that was not pity and was not admiration exactly, but was something between them, a recognition, she thought, one person seeing another clearly. "He sounds like a man worth knowing," he said. "He was," she said. "He would have liked you." The words were out of her mouth before she had fully decided to say them, and she felt the small shock of it. that particular surprise of finding yourself saying a true thing before you knew you meant to. He looked at her, and there was something in his expression that shifted very slightly toward something softer, not weakness, just openness. "I am going back to Guthrie Creek," he said. "I will be in the territory through the end of the month at least, filing my report and closing out the investigation officially." He stood, picked up his hat from the table. "I expect I will have further questions," he said, which was exactly what he had said when he left the first time, and this time she understood it for what it was. "I expect you know where to find me," she said, which was exactly what she had said the first time, and she understood that for what it was too. He settled his hat on his head and walked to the door, and then he paused with his hand on the frame and turned back. "Mrs. Atwood," he said, "be careful. The men who filed those reports have not given up. I am one Marshal, they will send others." She nodded. "I know. If you need to send word," he said, and reached into his coat and produced a small card which he set on the edge of the table near the door. "I am staying at the boarding house in Guthrie Creek, Mrs. Finney's place on the east side of Main Street." She picked up the card and looked at it. "Simon J. Sullivan, United States Marshal, Fort Smith, Arkansas." "Thank you," she said. He nodded, opened the door, and left. She stood in her kitchen holding the card for a long moment after the sound of his horse faded down the road, and then she tucked it into the pocket of her apron and went back to her bread. He came back 4 days later with a question about a property line which was transparently an excuse, and she answered the property line question and then asked him if he had eaten, and he said he had not, and she made him sit down to supper. It was the first time she had made supper for a man at that table since Thomas died, and the strangeness of it was there, present in the room, but not heavy. It felt, she thought, more like a door standing open than a door standing closed. He ate the way working men eat, with genuine attention and appreciation, and he asked her about the farm, real questions with real interest in the answers. And she told him about the 240 acres and the milk cow and the kitchen garden, and about how she had learned to do almost everything herself over the past 3 years, the fence mending and the roof patching and the machinery repair. Because hiring men to do it meant men on the property, and she could not always control when she had other guests. He was quiet for a moment when she said that, looking at his plate. "How have you done it?" he said. 3 years, alone, carrying all of this." "1 day at a time," she said. "Way everyone does everything." "But it is more than the farm," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is more than the farm." He looked at her. "Are you not frightened?" She thought about this honestly. "Yes," she said. "I am frightened sometimes, mostly at night when it is quiet and I have time to think about what would happen if someone came who was not you." She met his eyes steadily. "But being frightened and stopping are 2 different things in my experience." He nodded slowly. "In my experience as well," he said. She poured more coffee. The lamp on the table was the only light, and it made the room close and warm, and outside the spring wind moved through the tall grass with a sound like water. "Tell me about Missouri," she said. He looked at her with a slight surprise that said he had not expected to be asked. Then he settled back in his chair, and he told her. He told her about his father, James Sullivan, who had been born free in Ohio and had gone west and made a life, and raised a family and fought every day of that life to be seen as exactly what he was, which was a man. He told her about his mother, Catherine, who had come from Cork with nothing and built everything, and who had married a black man in 1840 when that was the kind of choice that had consequences, and had never once suggested that she regretted it. He told her about growing up in a family that existed between categories, too much of one thing for some people and too much of another thing for others, and learning early that the opinion of people who sorted other people into categories was not worth a great deal. He told her about the war, in which he had served with a colored regiment out of Missouri, and which he spoke about briefly, and with the economy of a man who had filed certain memories in a place where they were accessible but not constantly present. He told her about coming to the law afterward, drawn to it for reasons he had spent years examining and was still not entirely certain he understood. "I think," he said slowly, That I believed the law could be a thing that protected people. That the right application of it could build the kind of world where my father did not have to fight every day to be seen as a man. He paused. I have been revising that belief steadily for 10 years. And yet you are still a marshal, she said. Because someone has to be, he said. And because being inside the system gives you a set of tools that being outside it does not. She looked at him, this serious, thoughtful man who carried his contradictions with the quiet steadiness of someone who had made peace with complexity. Thomas would have liked you very much, she said again, and this time she meant it even more clearly. He looked at her across the table and the lamp light was between them, and she felt something move in her chest like weather changing. "Tell me about Thomas," he said gently. So she did. She told him about how they had met, she 17 and he 23, at a church social in Illinois, and how he had asked her to dance and been terrible at it, but had done it anyway with a kind of earnest determination that she had found immediately and completely endearing. She told him about coming west together, young and full of plans, and the years of building the farm out of raw land, the hard years and the good ones. She told him about the way he had built things, carefully and with an eye to the future, always thinking about what might be needed, and about the root cellar and the 2 rooms and the ventilation posts that he had never explained. "I think he knew," she said. "I think he had seen enough of the world to know that there would come a time when someone would need that space. He just died before he could tell me why he built it." "Or maybe he knew you would figure it out yourself," Simon said. She looked at him. "Maybe," she said, and then after a moment, "he would have been proud, I hope." "I have no doubt," Simon said, with a quiet certainty that settled over her like something warm. He left late, long after the stars were out, and she watched him ride away in the darkness and then went inside and sat by the stove for a while before she went to bed, thinking about Missouri and the war and a man who had grown up between categories and learned that the opinion of people who sorted other people into categories was not worth very much. She thought about his hands around the coffee cup. She thought about the way he listened, with his whole attention, the way very few people listened. She thought, carefully and with considerable wariness, about the fact that she had not thought about anyone this way since Thomas. And then she blew out the lamp and went to bed. He came back 5 days after that, and this time he did not have a question about a property line. He simply knocked on the door, and when she opened it he said, "I find that I would very much like to help with whatever needs doing on this farm today, if you will have me." She looked at him for a moment. He was wearing his working coat instead of his marshal's coat, and he had left the badge, she noticed, somewhere. He was just a man standing at her door in the morning. "The east fence line needs mending," she said. "There is a section near the cottonwood grove that has gone soft from winter." "I can mend fence," he said. "I will get the tools," she said. They worked side by side through the morning, mending the fence line section by section, and she discovered that he did indeed know how to mend fence, efficiently and without waste of motion, and that he worked with the quiet competence of a man who had done physical labor all his life alongside the other things he had done. They did not talk much while they worked, but the silence was comfortable in a way that surprised her, a silence that had texture to it, that meant something. At noon she brought out bread and cold smoked meat, and they sat under the cottonwood and ate, and the spring wind moved through the new leaves above them, and the light was filtering green and gold through the canopy, and she thought that she could not remember the last time she had sat under a tree and eaten lunch with another person and not been thinking anxiously about something else. "You are good with your hands," he said, watching her bite into the bread. "I have had to be," she said. "Your husband taught you." "Some of it. The rest I learned after he was gone." She looked out over the fence line they had mended, running straight and solid now through the new grass. "Necessity is an efficient teacher," he nodded. He was looking out at the same stretch of land, and his expression was one she was beginning to recognize as his thinking expression, the slight furrow, the focused quiet. "My report went to Fort Smith this week," he said. She looked at him. "And it says that I conducted a thorough search of all properties named in the original complaint and found no evidence of the alleged activities." He turned to look at her. I also included a secondary memorandum detailing the political and financial interests of the men who filed the original complaint, and the ways in which those interests align with the suppression of free movement by individuals who have a legal right to that freedom. She was quiet for a moment. That was a brave thing to do, she said. It was an accurate thing to do, he said. Accuracy is part of my job. Will there be consequences for you? He was honest. Probably, he said. Judge Parker is a fair man, and I believe he will read the memorandum seriously. But there are other men with interests in this, and federal marshals have been reassigned for less. I am sorry, she said. That you're doing the right thing should put you at risk. He looked at her with a directness that she had grown accustomed to and still found, each time, slightly startling. Do not be sorry, he said. I chose this. He paused. I would choose it again. She looked back at him and held the look for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then she handed him another piece of bread and said, "We have the south section to finish after lunch." He smiled then, a real one, the kind that reached all the way up to his eyes and changed his whole face, and she felt it in her chest the way you feel a change in weather, a shift of pressure, a door opening to a different kind of air. They finished the south section that afternoon, and then he watered his horse and accepted a cup of coffee and sat on her porch in the long golden light of late afternoon, and she sat in the other chair, and they talked until the light was gone. He told her about Fort Smith and Judge Parker and the strange, serious world of federal law in the Indian Territory. She told him about the network she had built, quietly, over 3 years, the people she trusted, the routes north that she had mapped out through careful correspondence, and the exchange of information that happened in the quiet spaces between official sight lines. She told him about the families, each one, what she remembered of them, the grandmother who had sung hymns softly in the cellar at night so quietly they were only a vibration through the floorboards, the Cherokee father who had carved a small bird from a piece of cottonwood and left it on her kitchen table as a goodbye, the Mexican brothers who had helped her repair her smokehouse roof before they left because they could not bear to leave without giving something back. She did not realize, until she had been talking for some time, that she had never told any of this to anyone. The full weight of it carried alone for 3 years was a heavy thing, and the act of setting some of it down, word by word, in front of someone who listened with that complete and genuine attention, was something that moved through her like physical relief. She stopped at some point and looked at the dark yard and the stars beginning to come out and said, "I have never told anyone all of that." "I know," he said. "I am honored that you told me." She looked at him in the near dark, this man who had turned away from a wall in her barn and chosen, in that moment, a different path than the one he had been sent to walk, and she felt something that she could not entirely put into words but that she recognized as important. "Why did you do it?" she said. "That day in the barn, you knew." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I knew. Why did you walk away from the wall?" He turned to look at her, and in the darkness she could see the shape of his face and the glint of his eyes, and he said, "Because some things are more important than the orders you were given. And because standing at that wall and feeling what was on the other side of it, I understood exactly what I would be doing if I reported what I found." He paused. "I became a marshal to protect people, not to be the instrument of their harm." She held that answer for a long moment. "Also," he said, and his voice was different then, quieter, "I had met you." Something in the air between them changed. She felt it the way you feel a shift in wind, a change of direction, a different quality of silence. "Marshal Sullivan," she said carefully. "Simon," he said, "please." "Simon," she said, and his name in her mouth felt like something decided. "I have been alone for 3 years." "I know," he said. "I have been very careful," she said, "to keep my attention on what needed doing and not on things that were not practical." "That sounds like an exhausting way to live," he said gently. "It was necessary," she said. "It is still necessary." He nodded. "I understand," he said, and she believed that he did. "I am not asking for anything, Edna." Her name in his voice was careful and warm. "I am only saying that I find myself here, on this porch, in a way that has nothing to do with investigation and everything to do with you." She looked at her hands in her lap. Rough hands, work-worn, the hands of a woman who had made and remade her life out of will and necessity. "I do not know what to do with that," she said honestly. "Neither do I," he said with a candor that surprised her into looking at him. "But I find that I would very much like to figure it out if you are willing." She was quiet for a long time. The spring night settled around them, warm and alive with crickets, the old cottonwood in the yard sighing in the breeze. "You will be reassigned," she said finally. "After you file this report. You said so yourself." "Probably," he said. "Yes." "Then what are we talking about, Simon?" He leaned forward in the chair, elbows on his knees, and looked at her across the small dark space between them, and she saw in his face that he was not a man who said things he did not mean and was not going to start now. "I am talking," he said quietly, "about the possibility that Fort Smith is not necessarily the fixed point I am anchored to." He paused. "I am talking about the possibility that this territory, this farm, has things to offer that Fort Smith does not." He paused again. "I am talking about the possibility that you are the most remarkable person I have encountered in a long time, and that I am not inclined to ride away from remarkable things without at least asking the question." She looked at him for a long moment, this serious, careful, brave, complicated man, and she thought about Thomas, who had built a root cellar with 2 rooms for reasons he never explained, and about 12 families in 3 years, and about how she had learned to carry things alone and had been very good at it and had not, until this moment on this porch in this spring dark, allowed herself to notice how heavy it was. "Ask the question, then," she said. He held her gaze. "May I court you, Edna Atwood?" she breathed. She looked at the yard and the stars and the dark line of the fence that they had mended together that morning. "Yes," she said, "you may." He exhaled, and she realized he had been holding his breath, this composed and measured man, and that made her smile in the dark. "Good," he said, and she heard the smile in his voice, that real one, the one that went all the way to his eyes. He rode back to Guthrie Creek that night in the dark, and she went inside and sat by the stove with her hands around a cup of tea, and let herself feel the warmth of what had just happened, carefully, the way you warm your hands slowly near a fire after being very cold, because going too fast can hurt. Over the weeks that followed, he came to the farm every few days, sometimes with a reason and sometimes without one. He helped her plant the kitchen garden and repair the roof of the smokehouse, and move the season's supply of firewood from the east pile to the covered store near the house. He ate supper at her table with increasing frequency, and each time stayed a little later before riding back to Guthrie Creek in the dark. He was easy to be with, in a way she had not expected, given his seriousness. He could be quiet without it being a difficult silence, which she prized above almost any other quality in a person. He listened more than he talked, and when he talked it was worth hearing. He had opinions, clear ones, and he did not hedge them, but he held them with a kind of intellectual openness that meant he could be genuinely changed by a good argument, which she discovered one afternoon when they disagreed about something in the newspaper he had brought from town, and she made her case with considerable force, and he looked at her for a moment and then said, simply, "You are right. I had not thought of it that way." She had nearly fallen off her porch chair. He was not the most comfortable man in the world. He was watchful and sometimes distant in a way that she recognized as the habit of someone who had learned not to depend on things being safe. He carried things quietly, the way she did, and she recognized in him the posture of someone who had been shaped by difficulty into someone strong, but also someone who needed occasionally to set the weight down. One evening, late in May, he sat at her kitchen table with a letter in front of him, and she could see without him saying anything that the letter was not good news. She sat down across from him and waited. "I am being reassigned," he said. "Not to another district. To a desk position in Fort Smith, administrative work." He looked up. "It is not a punishment they can acknowledge as a punishment, so they are framing it as a promotion." She absorbed this. "When?" "End of June," he said. 6 weeks. She looked at the letter and then at his face. "Is it what you want, a desk in Fort Smith?" "No," he said flatly. "Then what will you do?" He folded the letter carefully and set it in his coat pocket, and then he looked at her, and she saw in his face something that had been building over the past weeks to a point of resolution. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what it would mean to resign." She was very still. "I have been a marshal for 8 years," he said. "I have done good work. I also believe that I have reached the point at which the work is being used in ways that I cannot in good conscience continue to be part of. And if you resign—" She said, "Then I am a man with a set of skills and some land," he said. "I have land in this territory, 80 acres east of here, that I filed on 2 years ago thinking I might eventually want it." He paused. "I have not done anything with it." She looked at him. "80 acres needs working," she said. "It does," he said. "A man cannot work 80 acres alone and also work 240 acres. No," he said, "he cannot." She felt the direction of the conversation the way you feel wind before the storm arrives. "Simon," she said. "Edna," he said, and his voice was steady and his eyes were direct, and she thought that she had never in her life met anyone who could look at her as directly as this man looked at her, as though she were a fixed point worth orienting by. "I am not a romantic man," he said. "I do not have speeches. I have had considerable time on the road between here and Guthrie Creek to think about what I want to say, and what I have arrived at is this." He looked at her across the table. "I would like to stay. I would like to be part of what you are doing here. I would like to be the kind of man who is useful to you and present and who does not leave." He paused. "And I would very much like, if you will have me, to be your husband." The kitchen was very quiet except for the fire and the stove. She had known this was coming, in the way you know weather, a gathering sense of direction and weight. She had been thinking about it for weeks, examining it from every angle with the same careful attention she gave to everything, looking for the places where it could break or fail. What she had found, after all that examining, was this: that she had been alone for 3 years and had been very capable of it and had not been unhappy, but that the past 6 weeks had shown her what it felt like to not be alone, and that the difference was not small. That she trusted him, which was not a thing she gave easily or without evidence, and which she had given him in pieces over weeks as he had given her equivalent pieces of himself, and that the trust, built up this way, felt solid in a way that the trust of young love never quite was. That she was 32 years old and had learned, more thoroughly than most people ever learn it, that life was short and uncertain, and that the appropriate response to finding something worth having was not caution but courage. "I have conditions," she said. He waited. "The cellar stays," she said. "What I have been doing here continues. I will not stop." "I would not ask you to," he said immediately. "I want to help," she nodded. "There are people who know about this network who will need to know about you. They will need to trust you before they will use this route again." "I understand," he said. "Tell me who they are and I will go to them." "The circuit preacher, the Whitfields 12 miles north. A woman in Guthrie Creek named Adelaide Graham who runs the millinery shop and who coordinates information." He nodded, listening, and she saw that he was memorizing, storing it carefully. "And," she said, and her voice shifted just slightly, "I am not the same woman I was when Thomas was alive. 3 years of this has made me into someone different, more certain of some things, less willing to bend on the things that matter." "Good," he said, with simple sincerity. "I do not want you to bend." She looked at him. This man who had stood at a wall in her barn and turned away from it. This man who had filed an honest report and attached a memorandum detailing the political interests of men who wanted to use the law as a weapon, and had done it knowing what it would cost him. This man who had come back, again and again, without being asked, and who worked beside her in the quiet with a competence and presence that had gradually, without her entirely noticing, become something she counted on. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Simon Sullivan." He breathed, and she saw the release in his whole body, the relaxation of something that had been held tight. "Thank you," he said, and the simple sincerity of it went through her chest like a bell struck cleanly. They married in July of 1878 in the small church in Guthrie Creek, with the circuit preacher officiating, and Agnes Pierce as one witness and Amos Whitfield, who had come down from the north for the occasion, as the other. Adelaide Graham from the millinery shop sat in the front pew and wept pleasantly, which she later said was simply what she did at weddings, without further explanation. Simon had, by that time, formally resigned his marshal's commission, writing a letter to the court at Fort Smith that was polite and precise, and that he told Edna later he had enjoyed writing very much. He had begun working his 80 acres, which adjoined the north side of her property, and which, combined, made a substantial and workable farm. He had also, true to his word, gone to each member of the network she had named and introduced himself, explained who he was and what he had done and what he intended to do now, and let them decide. The circuit preacher had shaken his hand. Amos Whitfield had asked him a series of pointed questions for approximately 40 minutes and then declared him sound. Adelaide Graham had looked at him for a long moment and then said, "She chose well," which Simon had reported to Edna as the highest praise he had received in the course of the whole exercise. The people of Guthrie Creek had opinions about the marriage, as people in small towns always do, and those opinions ranged across a spectrum, but Edna had long since made peace with the fact that she was not going to be universally approved of, and had directed her energy accordingly. The people who mattered to her were glad. The people who were not glad were not people she needed to concern herself with. On the evening after the wedding, sitting on the porch in the long summer light, she leaned against Simon's shoulder and felt the solid warmth of him and the particular quality of silence that settled over a thing when it has arrived where it was meant to be. "Are you happy?" he asked, and his voice was low and careful, as though the question mattered enough to ask quietly. "Yes," she said without hesitation, because she had spent enough time examining the answer to be certain of it. "Are you?" "Extraordinarily," he said, and she felt the word in his chest where her head rested against him. The work continued. 3 months after the wedding, a family came to the door in the dark, a father and a mother and 2 small boys, free black Americans fleeing West Texas, and Edna opened the door and looked at them and then at Simon, who was standing behind her, and who said simply, "Come in and eat first." She loved him for that completely and specifically, for the way he had taken the words she had once said to her first family and made them his own without fanfare. They stayed 11 days. Simon repaired the ventilation posts, which had been degrading, and built an additional sleeping space in the lower room, and added a second lamp mount in the inner chamber, so that the family did not have to sit in near dark in the evenings. He did all of this with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, without being asked. When the family moved on, north with Amos Whitfield, they left behind a hand-drawn picture that one of the small boys had made, the farmhouse and the barn and 2 figures standing in the yard, a tall man and a woman beside him, both of them rendered in the earnest and slightly asymmetrical lines of a child's hand. Edna put it on the kitchen shelf. By the autumn of 1878, the men who had filed the original complaint against her had turned their attention elsewhere, partly because the investigation had come to nothing and partly because Simon's memorandum, which had been read by Judge Parker with the seriousness that Parker brought to everything, had resulted in a quiet inquiry into those men's activities that had made them newly cautious about drawing federal attention. Parker had written Simon a personal letter that Simon showed Edna, which said, among other things, that the memorandum had been received and noted, and that some situations required a man to decide what his commission was truly in service of, and that Parker believed Sullivan had made the correct determination. He had also, in the same letter, offered Simon a different position, one that involved working directly with the court to investigate the misuse of legal processes in the territory, with considerably more autonomy than a standard marshal appointment. Simon had shown Edna the letter and asked what she thought. She had read it twice and said, "It seems like the kind of work you would be good at." "It would require time in Fort Smith," he said, "periodically, not constantly. The farm will not fall down," she said. "I managed it alone for 3 years." He looked at her. "I do not want you to manage it alone," he said. "I want to manage it with you." "Then manage it with me when you are here," she said practically, "and trust that I will keep it going when you are not." She handed back the letter. "Write to Judge Parker, Simon. This is good work," he wrote. He accepted a modified version of the position that allowed him to be based in the territory rather than Fort Smith, traveling to the court as needed rather than relocating. It suited him, and it suited the farm, and it suited the network, because having a man with legal standing and the ear of a federal judge as part of the operation made the operation considerably more secure. The winter of 1878 was hard, as winters in the Oklahoma Territory often were, and Edna and Simon worked through it side by side, feeding animals and mending things that broke in the cold and reading by the fire in the evenings. He had brought his books from his room at the boarding house when he moved to the farm, a substantial collection for a traveling man, and she had her own, and they read the same books sometimes and argued about them with the cheerful sharpness of two people who were equally certain they were right and equally capable of being persuaded otherwise. She told him once, during that winter, that she had not known before him that it was possible to enjoy arguing with someone. "You have been arguing with me since I walked into your kitchen the first morning," he said from across the fire. "I know," she said. "I noticed it immediately. It was alarming." He looked at her over the edge of his book with those dark eyes warm in the firelight. "Alarming," he said. "I have been alone for 3 years," she said. "I was not accustomed to someone who argued back." "Did Thomas not argue?" he said with the careful respect he always brought to mentions of Thomas. "Thomas was a gentle man," she said. "He had opinions, but he offered them gently." "You are not gentle," she paused. "In the way I mean. You are gentle in other ways. But you do not offer your opinions gently." "I did not know gentleness would have been appropriate," he said. "You gave every impression of being a woman who preferred directness." "I do," she said. "I am simply noting that it was alarming initially." "And now," he said. She considered. "Now it is one of my favorite things about you," she said, and went back to her book, and she could feel, without looking up, the smile that crossed his face. In the spring of 1879, she discovered that she was pregnant. She told him on a Tuesday morning over breakfast, setting the information down on the table between them the way she set everything down, directly and without preamble. He put down his fork and looked at her across the table with an expression that moved through surprise into something that was so open and unguarded that she felt she was seeing something that very few people ever saw, the face of Simon Sullivan when his defenses were entirely down, which was beautiful in the specific way that true things are beautiful. "Edna," he said, and stopped. "Yes," she said, watching him. "Are you well?" he said first, because he was who he was, and his first thought was always for her. "Perfectly well," she said, "strong as a horse and not inclined to drama about it." He exhaled, and the exhale was a complex thing, relief and joy and the particular astonishment of a man for whom this was unexpected and good. "How far along do you think?" he said. "Perhaps 2 months," she said. "We will know more by the time the planting is done." He stood up from the table and came around to her side and put his hand gently on her face, tilting it up, and looked at her with such complete and unfiltered feeling that she felt the warmth of it from her face down to her feet. "I love you," he said, which was the truest and simplest version of everything he was feeling, and she had heard him say it before, and it had always gone through her the same way, clear and certain. "I love you," she said, and put her hand over his. He kissed her then, warmly and unhurriedly, and outside the morning birds were loud and the spring light was coming across the kitchen in long, clean lines, and she thought, with a fullness that was almost physical, that Thomas had been right to build 2 rooms in the cellar, because the world was always larger than you expected and needed more space than you initially planned for. Their son was born in November of 1879, on a cold, bright morning when the first hard frost had come, and the sky was the particular blue that only comes in autumn in the Oklahoma Territory. She named him Thomas James Atwood Sullivan, Thomas for her first husband because she would not diminish what that had been, and James for Simon's father, who had spent his life insisting on being seen as a man. Simon held the baby with the careful steadiness of a man who handles important things carefully, and looked at his son's face for a long time without speaking, and then looked at Edna, and the look was everything. "Thomas James," he said. "Two good men," she said. "He should have the names." He looked at the baby again, and then back at her, and the look on his face was one that she would remember for the rest of her life, a kind of wonder that did not diminish with time. The network continued through 1879 and into 1880, and Simon became a fully integrated part of it, his legal knowledge and his contacts within the federal system, adding a layer of protection to the operation that Edna had not been able to provide on her own. He knew which warrants were legitimate and which were instruments of harassment. He knew which territorial officials could be trusted and which ones had interests that aligned with the men who wanted the network shut down. He provided information that helped keep the families moving safely, and on 2 occasions he used his standing with the federal court to directly challenge legal instruments that had been used to detain individuals who had every right to their freedom. He did not talk about this as heroism. He talked about it as the correct application of the law, which Edna thought was both accurate and characteristic. Their daughter, Clara Catherine Sullivan, arrived in the autumn of 1881, healthy and loud-voiced and immediately certain of her own opinions, which Simon said was entirely predictable given her parentage, and which Edna took as the compliment it was clearly intended to be. Thomas, by then 18 months old, examined his new sister with the serious, evaluating expression that he seemed to have inherited directly from his father, and then patted her head with one small hand and declared, in the limited but confident vocabulary of a toddler, that she was acceptable. "High praise," Simon said from the doorway, watching his son watch his daughter. "He gets it from you," Edna said. "The praise or the certainty?" "Both," she said. Life on the farm in those years was full and hard in the good way, the way that work done alongside the right people is hard, the kind of hard that is also sustaining, that fills you as it takes from you. The 2 farms had been consolidated into one operation, 320 acres running from the cottonwood grove in the east to the creek bottom in the west, and they ran it together, dividing the labor the way they divided everything, by strength and skill and availability, and without much discussion of traditional categories. Simon was away to Fort Smith on average perhaps a month of every year, and in his absence, Edna ran the farm with the same efficiency she had always had and felt the missing of him as a specific thing, a shape that was not there in the evenings and at breakfast, a voice that was not in the kitchen and not on the porch. She found that she had not lost the capacity to be alone, which she was glad of, but that she had thoroughly lost the capacity to prefer it, which she was gladder of. She also, in his absences, continued to receive families into the root cellar, and to send them on their way north with full stomachs and written directions, and as much food as could be spared. The network was stronger now, better organized, reaching further north and with more reliable safe points along the way, and the number of families who passed through her farm in any given year had grown. Old Roberto Reyes, the dignified grandfather with the bad knee who had been her 12th family, and who had declared his knee would be fine in 2 days with an authority that brooked no argument, had made his way north to Kansas, and then written her a letter, careful and formal, thanking her for what she had given his family. She wrote back and they had maintained a correspondence, and in the spring of 1881 she received a letter saying that Consuelo had married a good man in Kansas, that the 3 daughters were all in school, and that Roberto himself had taken up teaching English to newly arrived families from Mexico, which he described as the most satisfying work of his life. She read that letter to Simon over breakfast, and he listened with his coffee in his hands and said, "Good." In the simple, definitive way he said things he felt strongly about, and that was enough. Agnes Pierce, who had been her nearest neighbor all along, figured out in 1880 what had been happening at the Atwood farm for the past 5 years, because Agnes was not foolish. She was simply talkative, and she had finally put together enough pieces to arrive at the picture. She had come to Edna directly, which was the right thing to do, and sat at the kitchen table with her hands in her lap and said, in a voice that was smaller and less certain than her usual one, "I have figured out what is in your root cellar, Edna." Edna had looked at her for a long moment, this woman who was kind but who also talked, this neighbor who had brought her pies when Thomas died and who had driven her to the doctor once when she had broken a finger and who was, despite the talking, a fundamentally good person. "Have you?" Edna said. "I am not going to say anything," Agnes said, and her voice was firm now. "I want you to know that." Edna was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Would you like to help?" Agnes had blinked. "Help? There is always need for more safe places in this network," Edna said. "Your farm is 5 miles north and your cellar is large. You live alone if you were willing." Agnes stared at her. "Are you asking me to hide people in my root cellar?" "I am," Edna said. There was a long silence. Then Agnes Pierce straightened her spine and said, "Well, what do I need to know?" Adelaide Graham at the millinery shop had laughed when Edna told her, until she had to sit down. The years moved as years do, not slowly and not quickly, but with the specific pace of a life that is full, so that looking back there seems to be more in each year than a single year could reasonably hold. By 1882, Thomas was 2 years old and had begun following Simon around the farm with the dedicated attention of someone conducting a thorough investigation, which Simon encouraged with the patient and genuine interest he brought to all things he found worth his time. Clara was round and cheerful and had her mother's eyes, that clear winter water gray that startled people who were not expecting it. And in the autumn of that year, on a September evening when the cottonwood leaves were starting to turn and the air had the first edge of cold in it, Edna sat on the porch with Simon after the children were in bed, and the stars were out in their full autumn extravagance, and she leaned against his shoulder in the way she had since the beginning and felt the solid warmth of him. "Do you think about those first 3 years?" he asked. "Before I came," she thought. "Sometimes," she said. "Less than I used to. Why?" "I think about that morning sometimes," he said. "Riding up the road, I had convinced myself I was doing a job." "You were," she said. "I was doing more than a job," he said. "I just did not know it yet." She looked out at the dark yard and the outline of the barn against the stars. "I was watching from the window," she said. "When you rode up, I was ahead of you before you reached the fence." He was quiet for a moment. "Were you frightened?" "Of you specifically, no," she said. "Frightened of what you represented, yes." "And now?" She tilted her head back to look at the stars, and then at his profile against them, the jaw she knew by now better than her own face, the set of his mouth that she had learned to read like weather. "Now," she said, "you are the least frightening thing in my world." He turned to look at her, and in the starlight she could see the expression on his face, that open, unguarded thing that was only for her. "Edna," he said. "Simon," she said back and smiled. He kissed her temple, her hair, and drew her closer against his side, and they sat in the good silence that was one of the things she valued most in her life, the silence of two people who knew each other well enough not to fill the space between them with unnecessary words. "I would like another child," he said presently into the top of her head. "I know," she said. "You have been very transparent about it." "Have I?" "The way you look at Clara sometimes," she said, "like you are calculating." He laughed, which was a sound that still, even now, surprised her with its quality, the way it transformed his whole face. "Is that a yes?" he said. "That is a we will see," she said primly. "We will see," he repeated, with the tone of a man who knows what we will see means. The third child, another boy they named James Thomas Sullivan, arrived in 1884, as the Oklahoma Territory continued its complicated and contested movement toward statehood, and the world changed around them in ways large and small. He arrived in the spring, loud and certain of himself from the first moment, with his father's coloring and his mother's jaw, and an expression that even in infancy suggested he had opinions and intended to share them. Thomas, 4 years old by then, received this development with the equanimity of a child who has been raised by two people who met the world steadily, and announced that the baby's name was a very good name. Clara, at 2, simply tried to give the baby a wooden spoon, which he accepted. The house had grown, as the family had grown. Simon had added 2 rooms in the winter of 1881, working with the same careful competence he brought to everything, and the root cellar had been expanded as well, not because they needed more storage for vegetables, but because larger families sometimes came through and needed the space. The network continued, strengthened over the years by the passage of time and the addition of new people who had been helped and had turned around and helped others. The Cherokee family, who had repaired her fence in that hard January years before, had established a stop on a route further west. The Quaker family, the husband and his wife and 4 daughters, had settled in Kansas and were part of the network there. The circuit preacher had retired and been replaced by a younger man who Edna had assessed carefully and admitted into her confidence after several months of observation. And the children grew up knowing. She and Simon had talked about this, carefully and more than once, the question of when and how to tell their children what the root cellar was for, and they had come to the conclusion that the answer was simply, when they were old enough to understand, and that understanding would be ongoing rather than a single revelation. Thomas understood first at 5, when he saw a family emerge from the barn's lower room in the early morning and asked, with the directness of his father and the precision of his mother, "Who are those people, Papa?" And Simon had sat down with him right there in the barn and explained in terms appropriate for a 5-year-old what they were doing and why. Thomas had listened with his evaluating expression and then said, "So we are helping people who need help." Simon had said yes, that was exactly right. Thomas had thought about this for a moment and then nodded as though this was the correct and obvious conclusion. "Good," he had said, and that had been that. Clara had been 4 when she understood, and her response had been to immediately want to bring the family extra blankets, which she had done, hauling them from the linen chest with considerable determination. James would understand in his own time. By the middle of 1884, the particular legal and political climate that had made the original investigation into Edna's property possible had shifted. Judge Parker's court had been increasingly active in challenging the misuse of legal instruments in the territory, and several of the most prominent of the men who had originally filed complaints against the network had been subject to their own legal difficulties. One had been formally censured. One had left the territory entirely. The climate was not fully safe, it never would be, not in this place and this time, but the weight of specific threat had lightened. Simon told her this on an evening in late summer, and she listened and said, "It is easier, but it is not over." "No," he said, "it is not over. Then we continue." "Then we continue," he agreed. That fall, a family came through who stayed 3 weeks, long enough for Edna and Consuelo. The mother, a young woman named Mercy who had been traveling alone with her infant son and her elderly mother, to develop a real friendship, the kind that forms quickly between people who are already in the habit of recognizing what is true in each other. When Mercy left, she wept, and Edna stood at the door and watched the wagon go and felt the familiar bittersweet quality of it, the relief that they were safe and the ache of the leaving. Simon came to stand beside her in the doorway. "She will be all right," he said. "Yes," Edna said, "she will. She is stronger than she looks, which is already quite strong." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood in the doorway together watching the wagon until it disappeared around the bend in the road. "We have done good things here," she said. "We have," he said, "and we will do more." She looked up at him, this man who had come to search her property and had turned away from a wall in her barn and changed the direction of both their lives in that single quiet decision. "I think," she said, "that Thomas built this farm for all of this. I think he knew, in whatever way a person knows things that are ahead of them in time, that it would be needed. And that whoever was here when it was needed would rise to it. Simon looked at her, and his expression was warm and direct and absolutely certain, the expression of a man who is exactly where he intends to be. "I think," he said, "that he built it for you, and you rose to it, and then I found you." She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had given her his honesty and his commitment and his careful, steady presence, who worked beside her without diminishing her and disagreed with her without diminishing himself, who held their children with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, who had turned away from a wall in a barn because some things were more important than the orders you had been given. "You found me," she said, "and then you did not leave." "I had excellent reasons not to," he said. She smiled, and he smiled, and behind them in the house Thomas was shouting something at Clara about a missing toy, and Clara was responding with the elaborate patience of a child, who is 3 years older and considers herself therefore the authority on all things. And little James had begun a cheerful and determined banging on something metallic in the kitchen, and the farm outside was settling into the long blue light of late autumn evening, the cottonwood leaves falling in the breeze. The cattle in the far pasture dark shapes against the golden grass. And the root cellar was empty for now, resting between families, its 2 rooms swept clean and the lamps trimmed, and the ventilation posts standing their patient watch on the far side of the barn wall, ready for whoever needed them next. The kitchen was warm and the children were loud, and Simon Sullivan had his arm around Edna Atwood Sullivan's shoulders in the doorway of the house that Thomas Atwood had built on 240 acres of Oklahoma Territory red earth. And all the threads of all the years had come together into this specific and unrepeatable moment, and she held it the way you hold something that is valuable and present and yours. "Come inside," she said. "James is going to knock something over. He gets that from you," Simon said, following her in. "He absolutely does not," she said, picking up her youngest son and settling him on her hip, and he beamed at her with his father's smile. And Simon took the older two in hand with the easy authority of a man completely comfortable in his own kitchen. And the door closed on the evening air, and the stars coming out and the wide, quiet acres of the farm. And inside the lamps were lit, and the fire was burning, and supper was being made. And the sound of 4 people going about an ordinary evening, in an extraordinary life, filled the house from floor to rafters. Edna set James on the counter and kept one hand on him while she stirred the pot, and looked at her family in the warm lamplight, Thomas explaining something to Simon with the serious face that was entirely his father's, Clara laying the table with her mother's brisk efficiency, James reaching with one pudgy hand toward the bread on the counter, and she thought, not for the first time, about all the people who had passed through this house and this farm and this cellar, and carried with them some small piece of it into their lives further north, and about how a good thing done in the dark is still a good thing, and how a life is made out of what you choose to do when you are afraid, and how some doors, once opened, lead to things larger than you could have imagined standing in the doorway. Outside, the October wind moved through the cottonwood tree in the yard, the one she and Simon had mended fence beside in the spring of the year they met, and the last of the leaves let go and turned in the air and settled in the dark grass, and the stars above the Oklahoma Territory came out in their full and ancient multitude, and lit the wide land the way they had always done, indifferent and brilliant. Watching over the small, warm windows of the house where Edna and Simon Sullivan were making supper and raising children and continuing the work, day by day, one family at a time. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.